trickle in a little bit more. Good afternoon, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My pleasure to introduce our Grand Round speaker for today, Dr. Borkovic, who received his PhD from the University of Illinois in 1970 and spent the next 8 years on the faculty at the University of Iowa. He has been at Penn State University since 1978, where he is currently a distinguished professor emeritus of psychology. Dr. Borkovic's research and clinical practice have focused on adult anxiety disorders. His empirical work has involved both basic and applied research, and his therapy outcome investigations on the cognitive behavioral treatment of generalized anxiety disorder were funded by the National Institute of Mental Health from 1984 to 2003. In the past, he has served on NIMH Psychotherapy Grant Review Committee, the DSM-IV and DSM-V Generalized Anxiety Disorder subcommittees, and several journal editorial boards. He is co-founder of the Pennsylvania Psychological Association's Practice Research Network and a fellow in the American Psychological Association, the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, and the American Psychological Society. His contributions to basic research and clinical practice were recognized in 1998 by the APA Division 12 Section 3 with the Distinguished Scientist Award, and in 2007 by the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies with the Outstanding Researcher Award. In September of 2003, he received an honorary Doctor of Philosophy degree from Stockholm University. So today, he's here with us to talk to us about basic and applied research in generalized anxiety disorders. Please help me welcome Dr. Borkovic.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. A little bit of reminiscing on my part. I retired 4 years ago. I'm still actively involved in consultantships and collaborations with a lot of my former colleagues. So now I get to do a lot of research, but none of the work. So it's a real pleasurable thing. I retired 4 years ago and moved to Tucson a year and a half ago, and this is really a great place to be. I'm very happy to be here. It took us a long time to get out of the north, but we made it. I started graduate school in 1966 at the University of Illinois, and when I arrived, they said two things. One, they were going to train us to be clinical scientists. That was what we were supposed to go out and do. And secondly, this was going to be the first training program in the country that was going to train us exclusively in something called behavior therapy. And I'd never heard of that before. So I went in to become a clinician, coming from Loyola University, a Rogerian-oriented approach to psychology, because Catholic dogma found only Carl Rogers to be in harmony in terms of the psychological theory. So I was going to be a private practitioner, probably doing Rogerian therapy, and the only graduate school that accepted me was the University of Illinois that was going to train me to be a clinical scientist and in something called behavior therapy. A very deterministic model of human nature. I came out the other end being well-trained in learning theory and in the beginnings of behavior therapy techniques, and with a real passion to discover knowledge. So I ended up, even in my dissertation, conducting therapy outcome research, but doing it in a way that would also give us knowledge about mechanisms, knowledge about the nature of the pathology, knowledge about the nature of the change process that occurs during therapy. And then I spent 40-some years continuing that route. So today I'm going to review a little bit of some of that basic and applied research. The emphasis will really be on eventually what's been happening in the field since I left it and some of the exciting developments that have been happening with generalized anxiety. There are a bunch of things about early behavior therapy that are very important even today. At least those things that they taught us contributed significantly to both my clinical practice and to my research. One of them was the best way to reduce a non-adaptive behavior is to strengthen its adaptive opposite. The implication then in research is to identify characteristics and processes that are typical of the psychopathology and then look for processes that can be strengthened that are opposite to that. Another point, and one of its main points, was from now on we're going to develop therapy techniques based on the best known laws of behavior. Okay, and this was revolutionary. We're talking about 60s when the prevailing approach to therapy was psychodynamic and psychoanalytic, with some growing experiential out of the Carl Rogers approach. This was a different approach, a way of thinking about how to develop therapy techniques. Base it on basic knowledge. It just happened that the best known laws of behavior in the 60s out of psychology were operant and classical conditioning. So it's sort of a historical accident that behavior therapy became the application of operant and classical conditioning principles. In fact, if you look at the current empirically supported treatment list, probably about 70 to 80% of them are directly a function of operant and classical conditioning. And the remaining ones are at least indirectly associated with those two principles. So that's how powerful of an impact that way of thinking about things 50 years ago has had on our field. On the opposite side, however, why haven't we come up with any new basic laws of behavior to stimulate another explosion of effective therapy techniques beyond operant and classical conditioning? And I'll try to share with you some ideas about how we might be able to do that. The third thing about it, we will evaluate the efficacy of our therapy techniques in experimental designs. This was also revolutionary. You might recall Hans Eysenck's 1952 article indicating there was no evidence that any form of psychotherapy had any effects beyond the placebo effect. So this was a way of trying to validate, to be accountable to society for the therapy techniques that we were developing. Now, starting as a learning theorist and a behavior therapist, to me, behavior was fundamental. And some folks, like Peter Lang, continue to maintain to this day that the best way to reorganize the brain is through behavioral change. And I think there's something still to that. Behavior is fundamental, evolutionarily and developmentally. But of course, evolution has given further layers of information processing systems, evolving an emotional system and eventually a cognitive system, including a whole variety of complex higher order processes. There's probably self-similarity contained within that from the chaos notion, that as each of these evolve, they reflect those processes before them but are adding something new in addition. The important thing, I think, however, is we need to understand that we are nonlinear dynamical systems, processes, interacting processes over time. So much of scientific psychology has been snapshot research, stimulus, response. And yet that's not, and that's a good approach for trying to find the fundamental building blocks of behavior and emotion and cognition. But in reality, we are interacting systems. A stimulus occurs, and this results in a cascade of interacting systems from behavioral to emotional to cognitive, all being recruited in the direction of fulfilling the prime directive, to avoid what's bad for my survival and to approach what's good for my survival. This will become important as we look at evolution of therapy with generalized anxiety disorder today. The question mark at the top means I don't think we're done yet, sort of like Edward Scissorhands. We're not finished yet, hopefully. We have a ways to go before we're going to create societies and global relationships that are going to maximize the likelihood of survival. And so I think it's useful to think about what might be, what processes might evolve. I'm going to shift over to that cognitive level and start talking about generalized anxiety disorder in a moment. But, you know, I spent 5 years in the Catholic seminary before I went into psychology. And now I'm trained as a deterministic behaviorist. And yet, the power of belief remained with me in terms of what I had been taught through my Catholic education, through my seminary days, and then searching through the literatures and discovering the placebo effect and recognizing that psychology does not have a good explanation of the placebo effect, neither does medicine. NIH in 2001 had the largest conference ever in its history devoted to what is the placebo effect and how can we pursue this very powerful psychological, physiological process. But even in those days, for my dissertation, I looked at systematic desensitization and implosive therapy in a clinical trial, contrasting them together and against a placebo condition. But it also included an expectancy manipulation. Half of the participants, and this was the phobias at the time, in fact, it was the scourge of the 60s, snake phobia. We found a target problem, a phobia that was widely prevalent, that we could conduct large-scale research. That's a bit of an embarrassment now, but it was a beginning point for conducting a lot of fundamentally good research. But half of my participants in each condition were told, this is therapy and it's going to help you be less afraid by the end of it. The other half were given an experimental instruction about why they were going through these repeated exposures with physiological recordings. And it had nothing to do with change. There was no implication that any change would occur. And there were a bunch of interesting findings, but the most interesting to me was that the largest effect size occurred by the expectancy manipulation. That was the most potent variable in affecting the phobias. So even in those days, I had an interest in these higher level cognitive processes. Now, beliefs are certainly products of our experience. We abstract from our experiences schemata, certain ways of organizing information. And they're likely to play a significant role in the origins and maintenance of disorders. It really wasn't until a psychiatrist with a psychoanalytic background, Dr. Aaron Beck, came along in the 70s and said, it may be that how we view reality is actually important too. And thus the dawning of cognitive therapy, and eventually it's being brought into behavior therapy. So now everybody refers to it as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the intriguing things about beliefs to me, as I was starting to do research at University of Iowa and looking at some of the cognitive features, was a book by Julian Jaynes in 1976. I don't know if you've read his Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Very interesting reading. It's been heavily critiqued, but his point is very interesting, using both etymological scholarship on ancient documents like the Code of Hammurabi in the Bible, but also historical documents. He came up with the conclusion that as we evolved from the slime, we became conscious, self-conscious, self-agent, somewhere between 3000 and 2000 BC. And one of his arguments was that around that time, tribes that had been isolated for millennia and had evolved their own theocracy belief system in order to keep this tribe together and to maximize its survival, we're now starting to come into contact with other tribes that had entirely different beliefs about reality. So it wasn't until that moment in time that there was any reason for me within a tribe to have any doubt about what I had been taught, what I had been told. And so if I'm starting to confront alternative views of reality, different beliefs, there's going to be two consequences: more and bloodier wars, because we seem to fight a lot to maintain our beliefs. But also the second really important possibility, that we begin to doubt what we've been told. And that encourages us to find the truth for ourselves. Now, it's an interesting hypothesis that maybe being exposed to a lot of different beliefs can drive a quantum leap in human consciousness. It makes me think now when you and I and everyone in the world have access to all beliefs, like through the internet, what effect could that potentially have? So the question mark, what's going to happen in terms of evolution as we confront a very different world, being exposed to very different beliefs, with real significant consequences to that happening? What is that question mark going to be filled with in terms of potentially the next quantum leap in human consciousness? Well, getting back to the ground from being up in the sky like that, generalized anxiety disorder has a lot to do with these abstract systems. Maybe one of the most important things we discovered in the early 80s was that worry, the central characteristic of GAD, involves thought, verbal linguistic activity. When I'm worrying, I am talking to myself. That begs the question, by the way, of when I'm talking to myself, who is talking to whom? And we'll come back to that maybe at the end if we have enough time. But at any rate, when I'm worrying, I'm engaging in focusing my attention on and generating verbal linguistic thought. Very abstract processing of information. It turns out, empirically, that when I engage in that kind of worrisome thinking, it prevents me from processing emotional material. Now, you might know Foa and Kozak's 1986 neo-behavioristic view of how extinction takes place in the area of anxiety disorders. Repeated exposure leads to a decline in the fear response. And their explanation for it was that with repeated exposure, if there is a complete pulling out and accessing of the fear structure stored in memory, there's a chance for new information to be added and placed back into memory. The new information is nothing bad's going to happen. And to index whether or not emotional processing has occurred, we can look at things like cardiovascular response to the stimuli. So we did a study in the early 80s, and it's been replicated in several different places in several different ways, that when I'm worrying, if you present me with fearful material, I don't process that material emotionally. It reminded me of Amanda, a character in Tom Robbins' book, Another Roadside Attraction. And she said, people deal with their problems at an abstract level. That way they don't have to get personally involved. From the psychological point of view, as long as I'm intellectualizing, Freud's word for it, indeed, I am not processing emotional material. And if I'm not processing emotional material, everything we know about mood disorders and anxiety disorders suggests that we're not going to change. Out of that eventually emerged a cognitive avoidance theory of worry. That worry has several different ways of avoiding our anxiety responses. It's old Maurer, 1949, two-stage theory of fear. Classical conditioning leading to the stimuli becoming anxiety-provoking, followed by operant conditioning. I avoid the things that make me feel anxious. That's understandable. We don't want to feel bad. But as long as I keep avoiding them, that fear is going to maintain because there's no opportunity for emotional processing, no opportunity for extinction to take place. So it appears that worry, wherever it's occurring, not just in generalized anxiety disorder, where it's a central feature, but in any emotional disorder, as long as I'm engaging in worry, I'm not going to be engaging in emotional processing of the material that I may need to process if I'm going to overcome this difficulty. There's another level of, oh, by the way, the main reason why worry is cognitive avoidance is the Zeigarnik effect, 1924 German researcher. The problems that we've solved, we forget about. Problems that have remained unresolved, the mind uncontrollably keeps going back to. And that's evolutionarily adaptive. So worry is very reasonable. The unreasonable part is why they're detecting threats so much in their environments to lead to the worrying. But the worrying itself is understandable. It's trying to avoid the bad outcome from happening or of preparing them to be able to cope with the bad event should it occur. So there's at least two cognitive avoidance functions that are reinforcing the process of worrying. There has been developments in the 90s and into the 2000s of more global beliefs, and we'll touch on these later on, but Dugas' intolerance of uncertainty, Wells' meta-worry, and eventually, if we have time, we'll get to beliefs about the self. It was also in the late 90s that Teasdale and Bernard and Pierre Philippot independently came up with a dual processing theory of cognitive activity related to emotional disorders. If we process stuff solely at a schematic level, an abstract level, it's not going to lead to any change in the emotional meaning, the emotional significance of the relevant environment. If we process it at the propositional level, the concrete level, then change can occur. So this is sort of a cognitive theory reflective of the early Maurer's theory about fear and avoidance conditioning. And it's a grander scale version of what we came up with the functions of worry, in terms of it being an abstract way of avoiding emotional experience. Let me jump to late 90s. A bunch of reviews during that time did come to a variety of conclusions. One of them is that CBT does have active ingredients. It's been shown to causally result in significant improvement beyond nonspecific placebo and some alternate treatment techniques for generalized anxiety disorder. And those gains are routinely maintained up to 2-year follow-up. When component control investigations have been done, looking at just cognitive therapy, just the behavior therapy element, which tends to be applied relaxation training, or the combination in a full CBT treatment, some of the time the CBT is superior to the component, sometimes it's equivalent. We took a look at the number of sessions provided in these clinical trials and found a significant difference between the sets of studies, which led to the conclusion, if you have 13 sessions or more to treat me, it doesn't matter what component you use. You can give me just relaxation training, you can do just cognitive therapy, or you can do the combination, and they'll have equivalent outcomes. If you're short on time and you can only give me about 7 sessions, then go with the full CBT. This tends to make me think in terms of the interacting systems. If you operate at one system level long enough, eventually it's going to be interacting with the other systems and bring them along. We have decades of psychological science that shows that every one of these connections is a causal connection. What I think affects how I feel, but how I feel affects how I think. How I think and how I feel affect how I behave, but how I behave affects how I think and how I feel. This is the nonlinear dynamical system. So when someone comes along and says, psychopathology is all about the fundamental behavioral level. If you can get the behavior changed in adaptive directions, it will magically bubble through the system and affect how people feel and how they think. And another person comes along, like Dr. Beck, and says, a lot of the action is in how we view reality. And if you can help me see reality in a more accurate way, it's going to magically bubble through the system and affect how I feel and how I behave. And Les Greenberg and experiential people say a lot of psychopathology has to do with denied or suppressed emotional experience. So if you can help me to access, and not avoid, but access those experiences and fully experience them in the moment, it will magically bubble through and affect how I think and how I behave. And the interpersonal therapists say a lot of the action is in how I'm relating to other people, trying to get my needs met, but I'm engaging in behaviors that are making sure I don't get my needs met. So if you can help me to change my behaviors in a more adaptive direction to get my needs met, this is going to magically bubble through the system and affect how I feel and how I think. Who's correct? As I said, decades of research says every one of those positions is correct. And our commitment is not to a school of psychotherapy. Our commitment is to the demonstration of cause and effect relationships and the development of interventions that will cause a change in one or more of these systems. moment to moment, as I'll talk about later on, sensitively aware to the client's cognitive, affective, behavioral state in the moment, and watching for the little openings that they give us to help us choose an intervention that we know has a causative link to that particular system level, to have a small impact at that moment, and do that from moment to moment. Like we don't have enough to do in therapy sessions. Oh, and these treatments were demonstrated also up to the late 90s. They have both central and peripheral physiological effects, and I'll show you some of those in a moment. This was conducted by my collaborator and friend Bill Ray at Penn State. We had matched non-anxious control folks for each of our GAD clients come in prior to a laboratory session prior to the beginnings of therapy. One of the most fundamental emotional processing systems is reflected by the startle response, mediated by the amygdala. So this was a simple startle probe preparation, but they were conducted with our non-anxious controls and our GAD clients during a period of self-relaxation and a period of worry. And what Bill found was that, indeed, if you have me, well, he found both state and trait effects. If I'm suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, I'm going to show significantly greater startle response than if I'm a non-anxious person. But secondly, for both groups, if you have me worrying during that period of time, it maximizes the startle. Encouragingly, after the clinical trial, the clients came back for a repetition 4 months later of the lab session, including the startle probes, and their startle responses had returned to within the normal limits of the non-anxious folks. So whatever changes had taken place in our treatment in terms of their anxiety, as reflected by the typical self-report and assessor Hamilton anxiety, Hamilton depression measures, whatever improvements were occurring there, we do see a reflection in a very basic psychophysiological level of change. This has been important in GAD because unlike the other anxiety disorders, there's no clear behavioral measure of when they're improved. It all depends on their report, their subjective experience. Their subjective experience, of course, is important, but it can be affected by demand characteristics and other aspects of the experimental and investigatory situation and not reflect actual change. But getting physiological measures gives us a somewhat greater confidence that there has been some brain reorganization that's taken place as a function of the cognitive behavioral intervention. He also had them engage in 2 internally focused tasks and 2 externally focused tasks. One of them was to do mental arithmetic up in my head. The other one was to imagine eating my favorite food. Those are the 2 internals. The externals was the traditional Stroop test and a videotape to watch of seagulls flying over the ocean with soothing music in the background. And the startle probes were again provided. Here we see again the GAD folks are showing significantly greater startle than the non-anxious folks, but only during the internally focused tasks, the math task and the food task. And remembering that worry is an internally focused thing. Their characteristic way of being is to spend a lot of time focusing on the thinking that's going on up in their heads. Those reactions also were moving toward normalization at the end of therapy. We did some spectral analysis of brainwave activity during worry periods in the lab, pre and post. And these colorful things are contrasting control participant with the matched GAD participant during the worry period. Now, pre-therapy, what we find is a lot less activation of the low-frequency elements, alpha and theta. Controls are showing more of that in the GAD clients. GAD clients are showing, in the gamma range, are showing a lot more activity. Gamma has been related, especially posterior gamma, to negative emotional experience. After therapy, there's movement in the direction of normalization of the GAD client. So again, we hope to have our clients saying they're feeling less anxious. But from an experimental scientific point of view, we hope to see whether or not changes are taking place at a more fundamental level. And these kinds of data suggest that that is the case. The problem up to the late 90s is that we're talking, even in the best outcome studies, of only about 50% of our clients ending up as high end state functioning people. People who have returned to within normal limits on the assessor measures and on the self-report measures. So it's quite clear that we were missing something. I've been working for 20 years on developing our CBT to be the very best we could do within the constraints of CBT. And so was the rest of the world who was studying GAD. And we couldn't get beyond the ceiling effect of about 50% recovery. In fact, looking at a review of it, we see an example of what I mentioned before. CBT is showing the best outcomes, not always significantly greater than cognitive therapy by itself or behavior therapy, applied relaxation by itself. But even then, at post and at follow-up, we're only hitting about 50%. So this, of course, leads to us trying to figure out what are we missing. We could continue to try to develop CBT, but after 20 years, I'm thinking we're missing something here. Of course, in the process of those 20 years, we're also doing a lot of research on the characteristics of GAD folks in comparison to non-anxious people. Some of it I showed to you earlier. And one of the things that started emerging as we studied worry and as we studied GAD was that that process and that diagnostic group does have an interpersonal connection. We knew that from our earliest study on worry in the early 80s. If you correlate worry measures with fear survey schedules, the top 12 correlations are all social evaluative in nature. Meeting somebody for the first time, giving a speech, being with a member of the opposite sex, being a leader, being criticized. And the non-social, non-interpersonal items didn't correlate at all with degree of worry. Secondly, when we did content analysis of our GAD clients' worries, the biggest content category was interpersonal. It turns out for non-anxious people, the biggest category is also interpersonal. Thirdly, the most frequent comorbid condition for GAD, and GAD has high levels of comorbidity, is social phobia. Simple phobia is up there quite frequently too, but social phobia frequently emerges as the most frequent comorbid condition. So we started giving the inventory of interpersonal problems, Len Horowitz's psychodynamically based but behaviorally descriptive measure of the things I do and the things I don't do often enough that get me into trouble with other people. And we found that our GAD clients had significantly more interpersonal problems than our non-anxious controls. We had been seeing GAD solely as an intrapersonal process. These data were suggesting there may be something going on in interpersonal behavior, interpersonal functions that may be a part of the problem. Also, it was interesting that we found that the largest cluster of types of interpersonal problem was being overly nurturing and intrusive with other people in my life. I'm trying to take care of everybody, so much so that they're telling me to mind my own business. That's how I'm trying to get my need met of being liked, of being loved, or whatever, by the other person. But the very thing I'm doing that I think ought to do it is actually turning them off to me. A year after we got those data, Jude Cassidy, a developmental psychologist, joined our faculty, and she was trained by Mary Main in the adult attachment interview and the Bowlby perspective on human development. And so she said, you know, your GAD clients sound exactly like the adult sequelae of an insecure attachment. And I said, well, that sounds neat. What is an insecure attachment? And she told me about it, and I said, well, please come and do interviews with our clients. Well, first she developed a self-report questionnaire before doing the massive investment of time that the adult attachment interview involves. She created a questionnaire to tap some of the attachment dimensions. And what she found was that our clients had been reporting insecure attachments in childhood. In fact, the main one was role-reversed relationship. Mom wasn't there to take care of my needs, and I'm just a little kid. And in fact, I had to take care of her needs. So just a year apart, the IIP is telling us that our GAD clients are getting into trouble in their interpersonal relationships by trying to take care of everybody. And Jude's data is saying, and this may come from their childhood experiences. To get mom's love, I had to take care of mom. She eventually did get funded by NIH and did the full adult attachment interview. And in fact, the first panel shows our GAD clients before they began therapy. And almost 60% of them are showing an insecure attachment of the disorganized type. I won't go into the meaning of that because of time. But notice that her major depression group was showing a similar kind of pattern and even a significantly higher level of disorganized insecure attachment. But one interesting thing is that pre-therapy with the GAD clients compared to the controls is in fact a significantly higher degree of insecure attachment. At the end of therapy, where half of our clients did not receive the AAI until they no longer met GAD diagnostic criteria at a post or a follow-up moment, those patterns are identical to the patterns of the non-anxious control group. Jude got very excited. She said, do you realize your CBT is changing their working models, developmentally based? And I said, that's fantastic, but there's a rival hypothesis, and that's mood and memory. That once the second group who were tested, after a successful reduction of their anxiety, they may be reporting more normalized patterns because they're not as anxious and they're remembering things from childhood that are different from the way they remembered them when they were highly anxious. So that's a rival hypothesis that's yet to be tested. There's a second thing that we thought we might be missing from our purely behavioral view, and more data were coming in suggesting that maybe we need to be targeting emotional functioning as well. This was already a part of our treatment procedure, given that we knew that worry itself was preventing emotional processing. And so in the CBT, we're trying to have them confront their fears in a way that is not being mitigated in its effects by the worrisome process. But then data from Rick Heimberg at Temple University and his colleague Doug Menon and Liz Romer and Sue Orsillo and eventually Steve Hayes with experiential avoidance, they were beginning to show that GAD folks are in fact not very much in touch with their emotional experience. Indeed, they're actually afraid of their emotional experience. At least on self-report measures, they were reporting being afraid of all types of negative emotions to a greater degree than non-anxious people. And in half of those studies, it was even showing that they were afraid of positive emotion. So this suggested to us the theme song from Pink Floyd, The Wall, for our GAD clients, especially in combinations with Jude's developmental data. When I was a child, I caught a fleeting glimpse out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but it was gone. I cannot put my finger on it now. The child is grown. The dream is gone. I've become comfortably numb. And so one of our grad students, Dean Akins, took a look at IAPS pictures from Peter Lang's pictorial stimuli, negative and positive stimuli, and looked at cardiovascular response within the GAD clients and their matched controls. And the matched controls show the typical bifurcated heart rate response to positive and negative information. The GAD client showed no significant heart rate change to either positive or negative information. So at a physiological level, we have some support for the comfortably numb perspective on worry and GAD. Given those two things, we thought, okay, for the past 15 years, we've been accumulating evidence that one of the things we might be missing is the targeting of interpersonal functioning and potentially the targeting of emotional functioning. And so my colleague, Michelle Newman, trained at Stony Brook as a CBT therapist, but very much trained also in experiential techniques with Marv Goldfried, adopted Safran and Siegel's 1990 book on interpersonal process in cognitive therapy. It's a wonderful book, but she adapted that treatment approach to what we knew about our GAD clients. The experiential element of eliciting emotion, all kinds of emotion, positive and negative, in the course of the therapy, was in the service of the interpersonal therapy. If I'm going to figure out how to get my needs met by other people, when my current behaviors aren't getting those needs met, I really need to know how I'm feeling in each interpersonal situation, both the positive and negative feelings. And so Safran and Siegel's treatment approach has an integration of emotional processing with the interpersonal therapy, ultimately leading to helping to identify our clients what they really need from significant people in their lives, and then of working out new behaviors to maximize the likelihood of getting those needs satisfied. So we did an open trial where our clients received an hour of our CBT followed by an hour of the IEP, the interpersonal emotional processing therapy. And without going into details, it gave us promising results. Here's the set of GAD outcome clinical trials that I've done from the 80s through the 2000s. And we were incrementing along with the addition of the IEP looking real favorable. So NIMH said, okay, you can do the experimental trial. Compare CBT with and without the IEP. And the control feature for the CBT alone was to have supportive listening. It took 7 years to do this study, 5 years to do the therapy, 2 years follow-up. We get no significant differences between the two conditions. So 7 years of my empirical life has shown us a route not to pursue. A few caveats to that. I'll tell you in a moment. Here's in terms of recovery rates. We do seem to be getting better at our CBT. And the IEP, even though it's not a statistically significant difference, is getting up into the range of 60 to 70% recovered clients. One piece of optimism is that Shiva Rezhan and her colleagues in Isfahan, Iran, collaborated on a treatment project. She didn't have the emotional processing elements in it, but she otherwise did a replication of our study with an Iranian GAD population, and she did find a significant difference on the central outcome measure, the Penn State Worry Questionnaire, at follow-up. The other part of it is, I had to watch all the videotapes to give feedback and supervision to my therapists. And we know that there were dramatic, significant change events that occurred during IEP. If we had another 30 minutes here, I would show you one of the most beautiful evolutions of a cure of a GAD using emotional processing and interpersonal methods that I'd ever seen. It was a masterful session. done by a former student of mine who had been trained in doing private practice in CBT for 20 years before Michelle trained him in the IEP. And it produced this incredible outcome. So our conclusion is that it can be a very powerful technique, but it's going to depend on a good case formulation. Do a good functional analysis to determine the extent to which emotional avoidance is part of the picture for the client, the extent to which interpersonal problems are forming part of the difficulties that our clients are having. The other possibility is that we didn't integrate the IEP with the CBT. Okay? For experimental reasons, they got an hour of CBT followed by an hour of IEP. And that's not the optimal way of doing integrated therapy. So it may be that if you allowed me to do what I told you earlier, that to be sensitively aware to my client's cognitive, affective, behavioral, interpersonal state in the moment, watching for little openings, and then intervening with whichever therapy technique had the greatest causal influence on that open system, we might be able to produce better outcomes. I'm retired now, so I'm not going to do that study. If you do it, I'd be happy to consult for free. What I've been talking about is an example of typical molar approaches to any psychopathology in psychology. Any difference we find between the pathology group and a non-pathological group, we think this may be the answer. This may be a causative element in the pathology. That's what we did with the interpersonal problems and with the emotional fears of emotion kind of thing. But we try to identify characteristics, take a look at the extent to which they predict, mediate, and ultimately cause worrying and GAD, and then target those processes in treatment. Much of the development in GAD from the mid-90s to the present time has been based on this kind of a paradigm. One example is Dugas' intolerance of uncertainty, where for him the central characteristic of GAD is that they can't tolerate any form of uncertainty in their lives. And so he comes up with, tries to develop cognitive therapy techniques and some behavioral techniques, repeated exposure to the worrisome outcomes as a way of helping them to learn to cope better, to live within uncertainty in a better way. And his most recent studies are showing a fairly favorable outcome, especially at follow-up, getting beyond 60% recovery. Adrian Wells took a different approach. He thinks that the core characteristics of GAD have to do with their fear that their worries are uncontrollable, which is a DSM-4 defining characteristic of the worry in GAD, and that they're dangerous, somewhat analogous to panic disorder folks thinking that their panic attacks may be indicating mental illness or that they're going to have a heart attack. And so he develops a purely cognitive therapy, or what he thinks is a purely cognitive therapy approach, to try to help GAD clients not be afraid of their worrying, to recognize that it is not a dangerous process, and that they can demonstrate some control to themselves. And his open trial that was published a little while ago was in fact showing some remarkable outcomes, almost to 80%. His treatment is currently being tested experimentally in Trondheim, Norway, so we're looking forward by sometime the end of this fall of getting new outcome data to see if this degree of outcome improvement holds up. Liz Romer was a graduate student of mine, and she was actually a therapist in one of my GAD outcome studies, so she knew my CBT treatment really well. She went off on her own as a faculty member and clinical scientist for the past several years, and she's been trying to integrate Steve Hayes' acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based interventions with the CBT treatment that we developed at Penn State. And much of it is focusing on viewing more objectively our internal experience, right? Of not reacting to the reactions, but being an objective observer of my thoughts, of my emotions. And secondly, of getting my behaviors to be more value-driven, to not allow my fears and worries to stop me from engaging in behaviors that maximize fulfillment of what's important to me in life. Her open trial showed similarly very high outcome in terms of percentage of recovered clients. She's currently doing an experimental trial comparing a control condition of applied relaxation with this combination of CBT and mindfulness. Then to bring us back home, right here in Arizona, University of Arizona Psychology Department, Henny Westra has been interested in motivational interviewing. And she's thinking GAD clients may not be very motivated to change. And that resonates with me because we find a lot of difficulty having our clients let go of their worrying. It's been with them on average for 13 years in terms of the duration of the GAD diagnosis. It's familiar. And it's constantly being negatively reinforced, both by the somatic suppression as well as the belief that worry prevents bad things from happening. There's a lot of superstitious reinforcement involved in worry. I worry, I worry, I worry, and the bad thing doesn't happen. We've asked our clients to identify their worry each day, and when an outcome occurs, to rate it in terms of whether it turned out better than expected, as bad as expected, or worse than expected. 86% of the things they worry about do not happen. And of the 14% where the bad thing does happen, they cope with it much better than they expected 80% of the time. Okay, so the Richard Lazarus primary and secondary appraisal kind of notion, that they're afraid of bad things happening, and if bad things happen, they're afraid they won't cope with it well, that happens very infrequently. And even when they both occur, they're still alive to tell the tale. So that sets up a perfect superstitious reinforcement paradigm. I worry, I worry, I worry, and the bad thing doesn't happen. I worry about the next thing, and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen. I wear this blue shirt because it keeps me from being run over by a herd of elephants. And I have a lot of evidence that it works. But this, in fact, is one of the negative reinforcement conditions that I can create in my head with my worrying that makes it more difficult for me to let go of the worrying, even at unaware levels. So Henny was interested in how motivational interviewing, 4 sessions of it before in using our treatment manual, how that might impact on GAD clients. A couple of other things that she threw in there as well. But she also finds her condition is this blue bar. There's no follow-up yet. But she's producing a little over 90% recovered clients, significantly superior to just using my treatment approach by itself. So this is very encouraging. We're starting to see increased outcome over the last 10 years. The final thing is Doug Menon and Rick Heimberg's emotion regulation approach. Their 5 therapy elements includes everything, including the kitchen sink. I don't know how their clients cope with this, but they're getting everything from CBT to acceptance-based mindfulness training, experiential therapy, emotional intelligence treatment, and some brief psychodynamic interpersonal therapy. Okay, and Doug sent me recent data. It's not been published yet, but it's also showing some fairly good outcomes in the range of around 80% and higher at follow-up. Okay. This is a rather difficult approach, the molar approach. The more significant approach, I think, and if I were starting over, the approach I would take this time around is the molecular approach. We want to identify underlying processes in worry and GAD, and then demonstrate they are causal. Causal of worry, causal of anxiety, and then target those processes. Andrew Matthews, my good buddy for many, many decades, and an eminent basic scientist, in anxiety disorders. Started in the late 1980s to take a look at attentional and interpretive biases, what's now called cognitive bias modification. He wanted to find out when is the earliest onset of an anxiety response, and then what happens after that. And what he found, and many investigators after that, is that as an anxious person, I'm detecting threat in my environment all the time. Even ambiguous stimuli, I'm interpreting in a threatening direction. You show me a neutral face, and I'll have a fear response to it because I'm interpreting it in a threatening direction, more so than non-anxious people. If you give me ambiguous sentence like the doctor opened the chest, if I'm an anxious person, I'm more likely to look at surgery than to come up with the interpretation that's equally valid that the doctor could be a PhD who was opening the treasure chest. That's not a good example because I think all of us in here thought about surgery given that we're in a hospital setting. But there's many types of ambiguous stimuli that are used to test this. And anxious folks interpret significantly more in the threatening direction. So, treatment then would follow directly from that. We can train attention, and we can train interpretive bias by simply having computer programs presenting the stimuli to us and reinforcing or channeling our reactions in the adaptive direction, in the non-threatening attentional direction and in the non-threatening interpretation direction. This is the first time in my history from early behavior therapy of pursuing basic knowledge to lead to new therapy techniques that I see that promise being once again potentially fulfilled. Good basic science on causal demonstrations leading to potential treatment techniques. The jury's still out, but initial information that's coming in is showing us that you can train these things in trait anxious people as well as GAD folks. This is just a snapshot of some of the studies looking at a variety of different causal mechanisms and processes, but also including 2 clinical trials, 8 sessions of training on a computer screen, training GAD clients and socially anxious clients to attend to non-threatening information within the display, rather than attending to the threatening information. This led to rather remarkable outcomes of 50 to 79% of the GAD folks no longer meeting diagnostic criteria at the end of 8 weeks, compared to a control group of 13%. These were GAD clients who got 50-50 random reinforcement of attending to threat or non-threat. Similar kind of outcome coming from Schmidt et al. On social anxiety. In terms of interpretation bias, similar kinds of things have been happening, where you're training me or channeling me, there's different ways of doing this, to end up with benign interpretations rather than the threatening interpretations. And these having causal influences on anxiety. So what's the future? I didn't lay out all the arguments for it, but I think imagery is going to make a comeback, at least with GAD and some mood disorders, where I'm up in my head thinking all the time. If we want to get emotional processing going, we've got to circumvent the thought activity, the intrusive cognition activity, and emphasize emotional processing activity. Imagery is a good way to do that in therapy. And Emily Holmes at Oxford, in England, and several other places are rapidly pursuing the new deployments of imagery with depressive rumination and with GAD worry, and showing very promising results. I think we will be coming closer to more active whole organism approach responding. Remember I said early behavior therapy was the strengthening of opposites. So what is the opposite of GAD and worry? The opposite of being in my head, focused on the future, would be to focus outside of my head, to focus on reality, and to approach that reality rather than avoiding that reality. And that means not just behavioral approach, not just cognitive approach, not just emotional approach, but all three at the very least. How is it that I can approach each day, each event, each person with a cognitive, affective, behavioral approach response that is the opposite to all the avoidance I've been doing, behaviorally, cognitively, and emotionally. And that, to me, has to do with intrinsically motivated behavior. How can I write this grant proposal from an intrinsically motivated perspective? If I focus on the outcome of getting the money and increasing my fame, I'm increasing my anxiety because it might not happen. And it's very important that it happen. And what is the effect of anxiety on complex cognitive performance? It decreases the quality of that performance. So the more I focus on the extrinsic outcome, the less likely I'm going to be able to achieve it. If I focus on writing grant proposals in order to get on top of the literature, to find new knowledge, to think interesting thoughts, to come up with elegant designs in and of themselves, to create poetry as I write to the NIMH Review Committee, to have metaphor contained in every sentence, where there's meanings underneath the meanings that I'm conveying in a scientific way. If I focus on that, I'm focused on intrinsically motivated things that are rewarding by the act of doing them and have no reference to the outcome at all. The more I can focus on the intrinsic, the more joy there is, the less anxiety there is. If there's less anxiety, what effect does that have on complex cognitive performance, creating the grant proposal? It will increase the quality of my work. How ironic, I have to let go of the external outcome to maximize the likelihood of getting it. And now we can analogize that to interpersonal relationships, to emotional experience, to every aspect of the client's life. Of getting the pyramid, nonlinear dynamical systems interacting and being recruited together in a positive approach direction, not just the reduction of anxiety, but the creation of approach. This idea came to me because of reading Joseph Ledoux's stuff and earlier in the behavioral activation system and behavioral inhibition stuff of Jeffrey Gray. See, us behavior therapists in our trying to do exposure treatment have only been doing behavioral approach. And we haven't been paying attention to what's going on in the mind and what's going on in the emotions. And the Gray stuff and the Ledoux stuff says if the CR never goes away in the amygdala and we're only building new meanings, then we need to build those new meanings in terms of all of the response systems if we're to maximize the speed, the generalizability, and the long-term maintenance of change. So there's synchrony within the system as it develops its new meanings. And not that one system is just fighting against the other systems in the attempt to create them. If I had more time, which obviously I don't, I'm already 5 minutes and 15 minutes over, I would talk about present moment reality is the opposite to thinking about the future up in the head. And I eventually get to the point of saying we have to kill off the self. From a Rogerian point of view, the ideal self. Turns out all that cognitive bias modification literature, every one of those studies says, of course, this material has to be self-referent. And they even manipulate the degree of self-reference to show the attentional bias to threat and the interpretive bias of threat. So I said to Andrew, well then, the earliest moment is not, I attend to the threat. The earliest moment is, I have a self that's being threatened. Some of our clients, in fact, face significantly dangerous situations, dangerous to physical survival. But a lot of our clients are not facing threats to physical survival. So what is the threat to? Part of it, most of it, perhaps all of it, is a threat to my way of conceiving of myself. So if I get rid of the self, I get rid of the anxiety and the depression. Sorry to go over.
We probably have time for one question. There's a question. There's one question maybe I can indulge for this.